right now, because I think women were raised with some feminist ideals where we're kind of like, hey, wait a second, this kind of sucks. This is not a good deal. And I think that frustration is really building right now.
Welcome to the Unapparent Podcast, the place that delivers deeply human stories about the unapparent truths of parenting. My name is Katia Reguero Lindor, and I am your host. Join us as we debunk myths surrounding parenthood and provide an empathetic, judgment-free space for parents and parents to be. We hope you enjoy the show. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Unapparent Podcast. Today's guest is Erin Spahr. I'm so excited to have her on my podcast. I've been following her on Instagram for a long time, and she's provided such valuable insight into what, motherhood is like. So Erin, thank you so much for being here. Could you give us a little bit of a background on you, your career, your children, everything you want to add?
Yeah, thank you so much, Katia, for inviting me here. This is like such a treat. I'm a mother of two. My oldest is 12 and my youngest is 6. So you can see I took a little break in between because the adjustment to motherhood was a big one. And I'm a therapist. In the last decade, I've been working pretty much exclusively with moms, working through like the whole range of feelings and transitions and difficulties that come up for mothers. And through my work, I've really kind of developed this feminist lens. And I think that when you work specifically with mothers, there's all kinds of populations we can sort of look through this lens. But with moms, it became so clear to me how much of the struggles I was seeing in my office from like a mental health perspective were so tied to the culture that we live in. And so that's what I talk about on my platform on Instagram. That's what I talk about on my podcast. And it's just like this lens that I have, and I'm really passionate about helping moms really work through a lot of the internalized messages and just like complicated feelings that many of us get from our society.
And that's why I was so drawn to your page and your content, because I think when you first become a mom, you don't realize, or you're not able to verbalize all of the emotions that you're feeling. And many times we're not, aware of how much society has affected our outlook on what motherhood is supposed to look like versus what it actually is. And being able to really be empathetic with oneself and really be kind and understand that what we're going through is hard. It's not that it just feels hard because we're not competent. It's because it is hard, and society is not really set up for mothers in a way that it supports us, right? So I would just like for my listeners to hear about the way you describe, Matricentric through a feminist lens, what that looks like, and just the term in itself. Could you explain it to us, please?
Yeah, so it's not even a term that I knew for, even while I was doing this work till like a few years ago. It's called Matricentric feminism, and basically just means mother-centered feminism. When we think about feminism, I think a lot of folks feel like motherhood hasn't really fit into the feminist movement and kind of previous waves of feminism. We think about like the second wave, like helping like women get into the workforce, right? And in a lot of ways, women were sort of coping with a society geared towards men by trying to be like men. And I think for a lot of folks, the way to feel liberated from patriarchy, right, the society that we live in, has been about trying to almost like not sort of become a mom, right? Like that was one way, because in a lot of ways I felt this, having a lot of privileges as a white educated woman who had, all kinds of resources, that there was ways that I felt the patriarchy, but it was much more subtle. I could still get a job. I could buy a house. I could get a credit card. I could vote. I could move through the world, pretty well. But becoming a mom, we realize so much that it's a lot harder to feel free. In a lot of ways, you might feel like you're losing a lot of freedoms. And often our male counterparts don't experience the same amount of loss. So this idea of matricentric feminism, which Andrea O'Reilly is one of the sort of like thought leaders on this, and there's a lot of really wonderful feminist professors who talk about it. But basically, the idea is being able to sort of integrate feminism into motherhood. It's not that we have to deny our motherhood in order to be feminists. It's more like, what would it be like to really acknowledge the needs of mothers? And why not center mothers in our society because of all that we do, provide, need, etc. So it's been a really good way of like kind of integrating these different parts of our identity.
And it is one of those things, as you say, that perhaps feels contradictory at times for, for us before we become mothers, where we're feminist and we want to have the same rights as men. And a lot of that, what that looks like is in the workforce specifically, right? But then we find ourselves in motherhood, and the workforce and motherhood do not necessarily align at all. And so then it forces us to realize, oh, wait, mothers aren't thought about at all, really, in the way society is made up. And so it's interesting how we're sort of, I say we as moms, I follow a lot of moms on social media. So I see sort of the trend and how a lot of women who aren't mothers, and don't really see it through our lens, how we have sort of not necessarily contradicting, but very different views on what feminism is and means. Just that's what motherhood does to you, right? It just completely changes your perspective on life and your priorities. And as you say, mothers give and provide so much. It's like the foundation of humanity, essentially, right? And so it's pretty ironic that we're not given a second thought in society. So everything you're talking about really resonates so deeply. And there was specifically this carousel that you published on Instagram that resonated with me. It talks about maternal burnout and 3 things that you suggested society can do in order to combat this. And so I'd like to talk a little bit about this. And I'm curious how many clients that you have coming to you with this maternal burnout and ways that you kind of help them navigate that.
Oh my gosh, maternal burnout is rampant, right? I mean, I think that most moms I see experience it, at least to some degree at some point. A lot of moms are constantly feeling burnout. I think there was like a survey that Motherly did a little while ago. I haven't looked at the recent one, but it was like most moms experiencing burnout, certainly in the way like after the pandemic, and just sort of like all that we went through to keep this society afloat, to care for kids and somehow keep everything running. Moms are absolutely burned out. And I think part of why I wrote that post was because often when we talk about burnout, the solutions we often hear are what? Self-care, right? It's like self-care. How do you fill your cup, right? And that was really annoying me to keep hearing this, even though I know it could be well-intentioned and there's something really valuable, I think, for some women to hear. I actually do need to prioritize myself. I do need to remember to take care of myself, but it doesn't go deep enough, right? Because one, we're asking mothers to just pour from an empty cup often when they're already burned out. Adding in things like self-care can feel like another thing to do. What do I do with that? And it's missing this community care piece that, I think more collectivist cultures have been better at, certainly like in America, in other kind of westernized nations, Canada, Australia. This sort of individualism that we have here is really extreme. This idea that like you're supposed to be independent and you're not supposed to burden other people is like such a ingrained value. And there's research that says that countries who have high individualism and this very like high intensive mothering idea, which we'll I think talk about later, which is basically like, we not only have to just feed our kids and keep them safe, but we're now responsible for their emotional well-being in ways that I think generations past weren't thinking about, right? So all of that we've piled on, and we're not actually supporting moms. So yeah, so folks in those countries have higher levels of burnout. And so the solutions have to be on a cultural level, on a systemic level, to really be bringing this village idea back, this sense of, we're all kind of responsible for raising the next generation, not just the sort of mom and maybe father in the home doing all of that work.
Yeah, so much of it is, as you say, that individualism, how it's like, oh, you chose to have kids, so you kind of deal with it and like you're on your own and figure it out. And that seems to be like the culture surrounding, motherhood. And as you say, in Western countries, at least my experience living in the United States, but I have seen how in other cultures that collective, responsibility does, it's just an inherent village that you have that over here we don't really experience.
Yeah.
And that, going back to what you said about the self-care, so much of that does not resonate with me. Like, I do understand, as you said, the importance of finding ways to take care of ourselves, because, how are we going to give the best to our children and we're not, the best version of ourselves? But in practicality, that's really hard. And logistically, it's like you need to have the means to have sort of childcare and be able to afford time away to do whatever the self-care may look like. And then the pressure to find that time and in a really busy life and schedule, it's not as realistic as society makes it seem. We're like, oh, just go take care of yourself. And it's like, who's taking care of my kids? Well, I am taking care of myself. And, who's taking care of all of my other responsibilities while I'm doing that? So again, it's like, as you say, the solution is so surface level, or the solution that we are given, when it should be a lot deeper and a lot more meaningful in a collective sense. So yeah, what you said, and I've heard it. I've had conversations with moms who are able to, like, once a week find the time to kind of have a day for themselves, basically. Mm-hmm. And that is so far from what my experience has been like. And everyone's different. Everyone has, like, different sets of priorities and support systems and all of that, right? So that really varies. But at the end of the day, if we don't advocate for more systemic support, it's really, really hard to get to that place where we feel, less burned out ultimately. I wanted to also ask you about a post you talked about restructuring the work week. We've talked about this in my show, right? But I'd love to hear about how this restructuring could possibly look like, and what would it take for society to get there?
Yeah, I mean, as far as like the how it actually will work, I think we have smart people who can figure this stuff out. Like, we've created this society, we've made decisions that, 40 hours is the typical work week. We could change that, right? If we think about sort of how some of the decisions in the past were developed, right? It was based on the society, right? And like thinking, okay, well, we're going from like a farming culture to maybe more of an industrial culture. We change how we do things. So we haven't really changed it in a long time, right? Doing this sort of 40-week schedule that isn't consistent with education, with schools, right? We know that. And, people have feelings about that. Of course, teachers are like similar to moms, burnout, like not valued. So I'm like 100% supportive of teachers, but it is okay, I think, to expect that sort of the school day and the work day would somehow make sense, would somehow be compatible, right? And that means we need to expect fathers and mothers to be flexible, to be able to be, I think we need flexibility because most of us don't have one person at home who can do the doctor's appointments, who can be home when the kids are sick. And so some of that is like, we need dads, I think, to step up and kind of, say that they need this kind of flexibility, because I think that's really going to help, move this forward. But yeah, flexibility can mean a lot of things. I don't know the exact answer. It could be 4-day work weeks. It could be, because like I don't know about you, but the weekends are just, we cannot fit it all in,
They
right?
fly by. Yeah.
Yeah, they're so intense. It's like the third shift. I say like it's like the first shift and the second shift is like the nighttime and the third shift is the weekend where you're trying to fit in family time, maybe couple time, getting ready for the week. Like we could use
Not
more
to
time.
mention, appointments aren't usually available on weekends. Like if you
Yeah,
like doctor's appointments or these kinds of things that you would ideally get done on your free time, well, Sundays typically doctor's offices are not open. Maybe Saturdays are not either. So yeah, there's really not enough time in a day, much less like this, weekend for all of the things that you're trying to get done.
exactly. So we need to either reduce how much we work, especially with all the increase in technology and being able to do like virtual. We've learned a lot of people can do their jobs virtually. And it would be great if we could actually reap some of those benefits rather than just like corporations exploiting that and getting like more from us and getting richer. It's like, well, what if you put that back into the sort of like time bank, not just money, but like time is a resource that I think a lot of folks are really needing right now. So, yeah, so less work, more flexible work, and then certainly like paid parental leave is a huge problem here. I mean, it's a humanitarian issue. Like the fact that so many mothers do not get to care for themselves, their bodies, let alone bond with their babies postpartum, like that is something that we could look at the rest of the world really and see models for how to make that work. So there's a lot of work we could do that isn't about putting more work on mothers.
And that I talk a lot about, paid maternity leave and how, I've been blessed to where I don't have, like, I have a choice where I don't have to go to work outside of my home, right? And I've been able to spend time with my kids and heal my body and, have the postpartum time that I need to like breastfeed and figure all of that out, right? And breastfeeding is so important also. I guess so many women I think want to do it and aren't able to. It's cut short because logistically, pumping out work and then, your supply goes down because you're not able to breastfeed with, your child for extended periods of time. And it's just so many factors in the quality of a mother's mental health postpartum, right? And it's so to me it's crazy that there's not more time for paid both maternity and paternity because I feel like dad's presence is so important. And not just that, it's culturally, the expectation that, oh, dads don't really need that much time at home kind of foments that sort of culture where, oh, mom is almost always the main caretaker and the default parent. And so going back to like the systemic issues and how, I mean, unless capitalism figures it out and like patriarchy helps them figure out that these work weeks aren't really sustainable for healthy citizens, right? It's one of those things where I think dads need to advocate for it a lot more. And maybe we'll find some change, right? Because again, women are not given the same, women who are mothers are not given the same respect in the workforce because oftentimes they have to miss work because they have to go pick up their sick child in school or they have to take their kids to doctor's appointments. And so, yeah, the men's are meanwhile at important meetings making decisions and their dads, they are also very like they have, a job at home as parents, but that's not necessarily affecting them at work versus women, right? I mean, I've talked about this before. I could talk about it every single episode, probably.
Yeah.
And I talk from a point of privilege where I don't have to personally experience those hardships. And so many people do, right? And I think that's why I'm so passionate about it because I cannot imagine how much more difficult of a time I would be having, as a mom if I also had to worry about all of these other external factors, in the workforce.
Yes, I know. And isn't that interesting that you're saying like it affects you but not in the same way? I think we need men to see that. Like it just because it doesn't affect you in that in that intense way that it would a mother. Like, you see it, I think we need more men to see it. I mean, like, what you're saying is absolutely correct, that women actually who become mothers are seen as like less dedicated to their jobs. We talk about sort of the motherhood penalty, which is really the way that we see the pay gap happening. Like, the gender pay gap is really about that sort of decrease in opportunities for mothers. And the interesting thing is that fathers actually get a bump, right? When men become fathers, they're seen as more committed, as like more trustworthy and like reliable. And we don't see that as for women. And so these disparities just get, more entrenched. And exactly what you're saying, this sort of like the way that parental leave policies are prevents us from really starting off with a lot of like equity in our homes, because part of this is like learning. Just because you birth a child doesn't mean that you're this expert on all parenting. We research it, we talk to friends, we try to figure it out, we learn on the job. And so if we don't give men that time to learn on the job, it's just going to continue to be this like divide. And I think it's really costing relationships. Relationships are not like, we're struggling right now because I think women were raised with some feminist ideals where we're kind of like, hey, wait a second, this kind of sucks. This is not a good deal. And I think that frustration is really building right now.
For sure. And so, again, going back to how the premise of like this work day is that, and school day, how they don't really align. It's how, okay, so then you're assuming that there's always going to be a parent at home taking care of the child, while the other parent is out working, and so, I would like for you to comment a little bit on that PTA culture, an example, of how we depend on the unpaid and undervalued labor of mothers. I've read you talk about that also on your social media.
Yes. So that post was this is the second time I posted that around the beginning of the school year, because I think that a lot of moms, we have this idea of like the good mother, and the good mother, like, it does a lot, right? And one of those things is she shows up to school, she participates in, like signing up for the PTA, signing up to be a chaperone, bringing cookies to the sports teams or whatever, which like I still, like, my kids play sports and I'm always like looking at my husband like, did you remember the juice boxes? And he's like, what? And I refused to do it, which, probably some other mom does it instead, which isn't a great plan. But, like, this idea of like that these are our responsibilities, and rather than creating a culture where we actually paid, like, we put money into education, where we actually paid like employees to do this work and resourced, our schools. I mean, it's one thing to be involved in your community. That's lovely. But a lot of schools actually depend heavily on, moms donating their free time and doing like real jobs. Like, I talk to people they're like doing a 40-hour work week for free. And it's all this invisible labor. It's behind the scenes, but it's actually being something we depend on. And so I think that is a real problem. And I don't know how political you like to get, but like recently, there was an interview, right, where I think a lot of us know about, where JD Vance mentioned that, like, this childcare problem, maybe we could just call grandma and grandpa, right? There is this expectation that we, rely on unpaid labor, again, of usually grandma, right? Usually a woman. And we could do all kinds of things, like pay, offer some sort of subsidy for a family who could maybe step in if that's even available, which it isn't for a lot of folks. So I think if we valued this, we could do all kinds of things. But the problem is that there really isn't a great incentive to support women, support families, support moms.
Yep, that's totally right. And I don't remember what country, but I recently read that there's a country that now their government is paying grandparents for their babysitting, essentially, babysitting their grandbabies. And I'm like, well, there's a country that gets it. I mean, it's not just assuming that a grandparent's going to be available in their free time, right? I mean, I'm big on like not overly depending on, grandparents because they've already done their job.
Yeah.
They've raised their kids, but I know from the goodness of their heart, they want to help their offspring and they love their grandbabies. But in my case, my parents still work. They're not retired.
Yeah.
And so it's not like they have all of this free time to just allocate to taking care of my children. Plus they live far away. So there's that. But yeah, ideally we would have people in our close circle, who, our village, who are also getting compensated, for their time and efforts because childcare is hard and it shouldn't be like just free labor, right?
Yeah. Especially since like life is so expensive. I mean, it's not like we have these people in the village who are just sitting around ready to like take care of kids, unfortunately, because everything we all, most of us need to work, so
right. Yeah. So before we depart, I want to talk about what you talk about, addressing intensive mothering, right? Which is essentially related to insanely high expectation placed on mothers. I mean, I think everything we've said sort of, alludes to that. But how can women cut out, the noise and focus on just simply doing the best they can? And like, what are some tools to block out those never-ending expectations?
Yeah. I mean, first of all, when we're talking about the systems, I know like for some folks that's like validating and they get angry, and I think we should be angry. And I also know some people feel like kind of hopeless. They're like, okay, great. Well, here I am. I'm in this situation. And you're telling me that these are complex problems that we need to, deal with on a systemic level. And so I think it's not either or. I think that yes, we should keep fighting and talking and having these conversations because I think that we need to change the culture. But individually, I think because of all of this, one is when you're struggling, just like you started this out by realizing that you struggling is not a personal failure, and that like really having compassion, empathy for yourself in the fact that you're struggling is super important. And everyone's going to have to kind of make decisions based on their own values, their own capacity, how much support they have, about which things they want to focus on and then which things they have to let go of. Because we cannot live up to this intensive mothering ideal, this perfect mother myth. Many of us are measuring ourselves kind of maybe unconsciously to some ideal because we definitely get these messages of the good mom, right? And I think it can be hard when our partners, if you're in a partnership with a man, like who doesn't have the same expectations, right? We say that men just need to be an involved dad, which is like the bare minimum for a mother, right? So I think kind of bringing that down a bit and saying like, I'm here, I'm showing up, I'm trying, I'm, trying to work on, how I show up in my family. And I think also kind of liberating yourself from the things that really don't matter, like how good you are at like making it seem like you have it all together, at being perfect, like being busy all the time, finding ways to just let your kids see you rest and relax and see that as like a really like a wonderful gift to give them, to be able to expect that of themselves. And so I think a lot of it is like being really clear about what you value, and then wherever you can get support and lean on people. Again, that's so hard in our society, but advocating for yourself to get help and whatever works for you in your partnership, with childcare, with your community, because it's really unrealistic to expect yourself to do this on your own.
Totally. And what you said about the relaxing, that's so important because I feel like we're in such a productivity mindset where if we're not constantly producing, for capitalism specifically, then what are we doing with our time? Like we're wasting our time or, whatever it is. And if you're not doing something that is monetarily compensated, then also like what's your value in society, right? And so all of these, things that you're saying kind of alleviates that expectation that we have to constantly, right, be doing something all the time to feel like we have value. And I think that's something I've been unlearning, throughout my motherhood experience, because I grew up with a mom that, and I've talked about this a lot on my podcast, who is a go, 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 go person. And she's just always busy. And that's the way she functions. I think, she thrives like that. And that's totally fine if that's sort of like your MO. That's her personality. Also, she's a product of another generation that was like that. And it's been liberating to recognize that that's not my personality. I do not thrive with being constantly like, what's next? Like productivity. That's not my MO. And it would just make me a lot less of a good mom if I was, and unhappier. And being able to learn and also teach my children that, we can be, quiet time and in peace and like, at home, and, we can play and not have like a structured life all the time. There's something liberating about that for sure. At least for me, everyone's different.
Especially if you're neurodivergent.
Yes, which I am.
Me too. I've figured that out pretty recently, right?
Same. And that's motherhood threw me into that. Oh, here you are, ADHD. But yeah.
Yeah, I'm right with you on that.
Well, thank you so much. This conversation has been just so enriching, and it fulfills that part of me that I need to feel like this is my productivity, right? This is what I'm doing to give back to, the community and using my privilege. And it actually, really just makes my brain light up. So, thank you.
Me too. It's lovely to talk to other people who just like get this and are passionate about this and passionate about moms. So it feels like, kindred spirits when I talk to other mom advocates. So thank you for inviting me.
For sure. So for our listeners, where can they find you and follow you and listen to all your amazing content?
Yep. So you can find me on Instagram at feminist.mom.therapist. Also, my podcast is the Feminist Mom Podcast. So wherever you get your podcasts, you can listen to that. My website is actually erinspahrtherapy.com. And also, I've been creating this directory for basically moms and families to be able to find therapists, doulas, lactation consultants, basically like your whole village. And it's really important to me to connect families to inclusive care. So I started this inclusive provider directory, which is at inclusiveproviders.com. You can check that out. And we're really trying to build that so that we can just connect families with like really good teams of people. So definitely check that out.
That's amazing. I commend you on that. My midwives are the way I found eventually my therapist, my pediatrician, my chiropractor. It's been like my whole, village of care as a mom. So that's so important. And it really leads you to the right people once you've started with like the right person. And it's like a beautiful circle. So anyway, I'll part with this. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Gracias, and thank you for listening to this episode of the Unapparent Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe as we release a new episode at least every month with an exciting new guest. Be sure to also follow us on Instagram for all the unapparent content you never knew you needed.